evening. This is Hannah Klein. Welcome to my podcast, Hannah Klein's Time. Before I start my podcast, please subscribe to my Substack. If you become a paid member, there is, of course, bonus contents and also I have to say that the newsletter, but I have to say that you support me, really. So today's guest is the youngest syndicated columnist, sorry, in the world, really. He's a very bright person, Gregory Lyakhov. He is going to talk about he talked about his family background to me. Well, the interview took place yesterday, so it's a day old, but it's still just up to date because we discussed some issues that the Japanese media love to raise. For example, DEI, right? Like Trump banned DEI, like discriminated, blah, 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 right? It was very, and, it's not about agreement or disagreement, but it is important to listen to somebody. And I just want to remind people, remind you that Mamdani is not the mayoral candidate. He is not from a working class, or he's not even a middle class. Okay? I just talked about what he is on my podcast and what he has been doing. It's not even funny, really. And very well. Gregory is very intelligent, in my opinion. He's very young. He's a high school student, so very bright, right? So I hope that you enjoy our conversation, really. Okay, I would like you to introduce yourself later, but I have been watching Al Jazeera for decades, actually,
Hmm.
and it's obviously strange. You know,
Yeah.
it's it's very, very, very strange, and I would not trust as the first source in the first place at all.
Yeah.
And so and also I have completely different impression on Israel because, Israel has a very, great national security level and, and people are very nice. And, as I told you, I have known, I have the same pin,
Yeah.
for the victim, yeah, the hostages. But, like I have, um, what would I say? Like, anyway, but I just forget what I was saying. But I, anyway, I'll be discussing, all these propaganda thing with, Susan Keith. She's
Yeah.
professional at that, but
Exactly.
I hope that, your article, has been, I would like you to, talk about your, opinion on, the national policies, especially the domestic policies, because, I do not think there are Japanese listeners, of course, and because there are, like downloads from Japan, the United States, and Europe, and some other places too. But I hope that, if you could explain some, like, I told, I wrote to you about like charter school, all these systems.
Exactly.
I mean, that's very, understandable to people, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway, could you, talk about your background if possible?
Sure. Sure. So, just to introduce myself, I'm currently the youngest nationally syndicated columnist in the world. I
Yeah.
write as a columnist for Newsmax and Town Hall Media, as
Hmm.
well as, regularly contributing to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, The Hill, which I contributed to yesterday, and, dozens of other outlets. I'm also a big advocate for Israel. Uh, I currently have my own newsletter, which has around 39,000 subscribers, in which, that's where I advocate a lot for Israel. I write for a lot of Israeli newspapers. It's,
Hmm.
I'm personally Jewish, so it's very important to me. My parents come from the Soviet Union, so they faced a lot of oppression, and I have, ancestors who perished in the Holocaust, so it's definitely, something
Oh.
personal to me.
So, if I may ask, which part of Soviet Union?
Yeah, so my mom is actually from Kiev, Ukraine, and my father is from
Oh,
Moscow.
oh, I see.
Yeah, so it's the complete opposite now, but they used to be both cities used to be very close to one another.
Oh, wow. So, did they move, well, did your parents move to the United States
They did.
when did they move to?
Yeah, they moved in the 1990s right before the Soviet Union collapsed in
Oh,
1990 and
okay.
1991, I believe.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And their entire goal to come to the United States was to get free of this anti-Semitic propaganda that they were facing in the Soviet Union, which, it's funny because now when we look in the United States, all we see is
Mhm.
anti-Semitic propaganda. And then, obviously education is very important. But now when we have schools, that are sponsoring this anti-Semitism, and when we have people like Mamdani, who is being elected in the city who hosts the biggest amount of Jews outside of Israel, it's almost laughable at this point
Yeah.
because it doesn't
I,
seem like New York City is, or even the entire United States is pro-Israel anymore.
mm, I have friends in the States, and I have been to California very often. The people that I know of in California were, some Jewish, but not necessarily. And I mainly, I had spent time with an Irish family, Catholic.
Hmm.
But I especially have two of my friends living in Virginia, Texas. They're very pro-Israel. And so, what they were saying was that, they are very scared of going to downtown areas.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
like, they live in a quiet suburb. So, it's very peaceful. But, like I like considering like California, you know, I did not spend time in downtown.
Hmm.
Oh, like Korean town, like Chinatown, like like all these towns, like downtown areas, not very safe and necessarily in my opinion. And my mom's friends, who hosted me, they did not, well, like they lived very close to the beach area, so they were very far from LA count, like LA downtown, really. So
Hmm.
I never went there.
Yeah.
Almost. Maybe like once or twice. But I
Yeah.
saw the protest in downtown area. I mean,
Yeah.
it's shocking, really.
You know, that doesn't even touch the tip of the iceberg, really, for the protests. What happened in LA is
Mm,
terrible. Luckily, it dissimated quite quickly, but
yeah.
what's important to realize is that that isn't the biggest issue. You know, the protests that are happening in
Mm.
Los Angeles, that's only affecting one city. What's a
Yeah.
much bigger issue is the persona behind this protest. When we see
Oh.
liberal outlets like the New York Times, which is the most read liberal newspaper in the
Hmm.
world, when we see the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every other major news media outlet other than, let's say, Fox News,
Hmm.
then when we see those outlets supporting or calling these protests nonviolent or, activism protests instead of riots, that's when
Mm.
the issue becomes much bigger because we see a widespread support for these protests. And it also seems as if the entire liberal base comes to support these protests, comes to support whether they're pro-Palestinian protests, whether they're anti-illegal deportation protests. That's where the issue is. It comes from these liberal media outlets who are not condemning these protests, who are not even talking bad about them or showing the other side of things.
Mm. Well, Japan has been accepting, those who are deported, who face deportation, in the United States, and I actually disagree with this, uh, yeah, because, and also, the problem with the Japanese media is that, Trump administration, for example, they claim really that, they are suppressing the free speech.
Hmm.
I mean, it's not a free speech. And you know what's basically, if you say, like protest, just, I said just a tip of the iceberg, as you say, but it's very violent in Japan,
Exactly.
right? I mean, they may use guns even, all these, I mean, it's not a peaceful protest that is happening in the United States. And also, I do not think that it's not about like liberal agenda or something anymore. It's very, very violent, something. Because, see, like, I do not mind, people being, gay, or, but, what's shocking me, you were writing about this inclusion, DEI policy,
Mhm.
for example, and actually, like the Japanese media, this is something that they were criticizing. This, Trump administration, stopped, like this policy, and there will be no like inclusion in this society. But, I was talking with other person, lawyer, like retired lawyer, who was, yeah, who and what's difficult is that like it's required by law to hire certain number of you know um like races under that law, and um like in that case, also, like Jewish people had been facing some kind of, anti-Semitism, at that time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, one of my articles that I wrote a few months ago actually discussed how DEI was anti-Semitism in a way. Because what DEI is it basically says what these racial quotas do is it basically says that, okay, we're going to limit the amount of Jewish students that can get into this program, or we're going to limit the amount of white students or Asian students or any other race that's not considered, the minority.
Mhm.
And when we limit these things. These, we had these same exact limits when in the 1960s when Jews were only allowed to be accepted into Harvard at 2% rates,
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
scary. It
Mm.
really is scary. And the intention behind DEI, I believe is good. I don't believe that the intention is bad. I think that, having inclusion among all races is a very good
Yeah,
idea.
yeah,
We
exactly.
can't, the entire agenda right now, the issue is that it turned to an idea that, race is what makes us diverse. And that's not true. Race has no, diversifying factor. I don't look at someone differently just because they're a different race than me. I
Yeah.
look at someone differently because they have different thoughts than
Mm,
me. And the diversity of thought is much more important than the
mm,
diversity of race. And those two are very different. So what the Trump administration is not saying, they're not saying that just because people are different from us, we're not going to let them into universities. No, what he is saying is that we're not going to let race be the justifying factor of whether you get into somewhere or whether you don't, because that is racism.
yeah,
So if
exactly.
we, understand that the diversity of thought is where we should really be based in, then DEI turns into something completely else that everyone supports because everyone supports a diversity of thought. No one should support a diversity quotas of certain races. That's just ridiculous.
See, like, my impression on, DEI, for example, or I have to say identity politics in a sense. People give out race and say like, I am different,
Hmm.
if that goes that level, it's something a little bit of a problem, I think. That, then, for example, I would say, does Japan have the color? You know?
Exactly.
So, there has been, there has been more, diverse, I guess that, population in Japan, not just, the Japanese, who lived in Japan for a long time, but, there have been, half Japanese, half American, half, and those people, I mean, they are all Japanese if they were born in Japan by law, you know.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's very, very strange for me to, you know, uh, uh, pick up people as unique just because of the color or maybe the thoughts, in a sense. But, yeah, especially by color, it's very strange to me. But, it happens in uh, the Japanese society in a sense, sadly it does. But it's if it becomes like, we're different from, each other, it is not diverse anymore. I mean,
Exactly.
the nation has to, I mean, have unity in a sense, as a whole. Like the United States, I believe that, United States is a great country because of the diversity, really, right?
Hmm.
But,
Yeah.
you know, I I I don't exactly understand what the medias are really, in Japan are actually discussing. But, the school policy, in New York City, I was reading, your article, you sent me, just
Hmm.
yesterday. I mean, it was very, very interesting to me because, some people who lived in New York was saying the public school.
Yeah. Let
It's
me
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll actually add on to that. It's very interesting that you bring up, New York school policy right after, our conversation on DEI
Yeah,
because they go very hand in hand.
yeah,
When you saw under the Biden administration
yeah,
the Department of Education
mm,
literally, imposed a DEI mandate among not only private universities, but all public schools. We had signs all over, public schools with diversity, equity, inclusion signs. We had clubs labeled diversity, equity, inclusion. You
mm,
know, Even in our private universities, we had, Harvard getting stipends from the Biden administration for having a diversity include and inclusion
mm,
office on their campus.
mm,
So when we have those policies, it's more of an issue with the government. And that's why when we see Trump
mm,
taking action to close the Department of Education,
mm,
that's very good because it prevents this same exact issue from, coming again. And when we look at New York City specifically, we see that public schools uh, are not good at all. We have public schools with a 0% pass rate on standardized exams. And believe me, as someone who just took those standardized exams less than a month ago, they're the
Mm.
easiest thing in the world, okay? So when we have a 0% pass rate for an entire school, there's
Mm.
something very concerning there. Not only that, but when, New York State spends the most money per state than any other state, in the entire United States, about $38,000 per student. When we
Mm.
spend that much money, which is the average income of Flint, Michigan, so an entire family makes that much money. You know, when we spend that much money per student on education, we expect some good education, but the truth is we never get those results. We get very bad education usually.
Mm.
And you know, when we had the Democratic mayoral primary where Mamdani just got elected, his entire idea is to put entire reliance on these public schools, which are clearly failing students. New York City has a very interesting policy in which charter schools
Mm.
have an active role in low-income communities. So let me
Mm.
give you an example. Let's say you're a student in Harlem, New York,
Mm.
and your public school that you're assigned to is a school with a 0% pass rate on the standardized exams. You can choose to put your taxpayer money into a charter school. This
Mm.
charter school has an 83% pass rate. It's a much better school.
Mm.
It doesn't require any extra money, and you can attend it and have a completely different education experience than the one you were assigned to. What Mondani wants to do is he wants to shut this option down. He wants to shut down charter schools, which would, ruin the education for millions of students all around the country.
Well, see, he's like a rich boy, huh? And I saw the first thing I saw was that, Mandani like crying, like more like Arabs like die, and we like whatever. That was something that he was mocking. This He was extremely anti-Semitic, and that was the press. He was doing that in front of the press.
Mhm.
And that was just before, I think that was before, yeah, that was before this primary, right? I guess. And,
Yeah.
I saw this result and it was like, who was voting for that? It goes like, who went to vote that? Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's the scary truth. And the thing is, he's not the only one. Again, he's just the very, very tip of the iceberg. We have members in Congress like
Mm.
AOC, Rashida
Oh, yeah.
Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, real anti-Semitic bigots. Those type of people is the hard radical left. And the thing I find extremely scary, and I also just wrote an article about this in the American Spectator, and I have one coming out in the Jerusalem Post. The
Mm.
thing is that this is the new Democratic Party.
Mm.
When we have the biggest city in the world, in the United States,
Mm.
electing a, person to represent them that is
Mm.
a self-identified socialist,
Oh,
a
yeah. That's
anti-Semite,
very scary.
and,
Yeah.
an Israel hater. When we
Mm.
have the biggest city in the United States elect
Mm.
someone like that as mayor,
Mm.
there is something truly wrong with our system. And, I truly believe that the Jewish people don't have a home in the Democratic Party anymore. I think if
Mm.
you're a Jew and you vote for the Democratic Party, then you're ill-informed. I don't see how you can support these types of people, you know, and when we have New York City, which has the biggest Jewish population outside of
Mm.
Israel, and when we have that city also vote for radical left candidates like Mamdani,
Mm.
there's a deeply rooted issue in American society. This is what we've seen at the start of the Holocaust. Okay, we've seen
Oh.
people voting for completely radical anti-Semites, and this is why it scares me so much. So what we need to do is, spread the advocacy right now, make sure that this doesn't happen again, and we can only hope for the best, but it's not looking good. It really isn't.
Yeah, like, you know, I have, it's not just October 7th that I have seen, but that was like, I don't have words, really. And I really, really feel sorry for, the hostages family. And also, the victims. And I think that, people, vast amount of people, who are not exactly the victims, were devastated, you know,
Exactly.
the nation
You
was
know, October
devastated.
7th, I say this quite often. It's really what happened on October 8th that,
Yeah.
set the whole world on fire, and it made all the Jewish people victims of October 7th and the horrific attack. So we have people who were killed on that day, but we also have people who were killed, throughout the year because of the anti-Semitic attacks that came after that. So,
Mhm.
um, I blame October 7th in part on the Israeli government. I do. I believe that it was a lack of care or a lack of, you know, um, protection for the Jewish people. I think that the Israeli government was too relaxed, and that's how October 7th happened. But, what I blame 100% on the American people and especially on the radical left, like AOC, Mamdani, I blame the
Mhm.
anti-Semitism that spread after that. When we see attacks in Boulder, Colorado, when we see, protests, my sister was locked into libraries in her school, because of the
Oh, your
anti-Semitic
sister?
protests. Yeah, she goes to
Oh,
college in the city.
oh,
So
wow.
yeah.
Sorry.
So when we have those events and when
Mhm.
Jewish people are scared for their lives, even
Right.
when I wear a hostage pin and walk around in the city, people say things when we have those events in our city. Like, are we a free country anymore? It's not clear. It really isn't. That's what scares me the most. It's all because of this radical left agenda.
Mm.
And I don't believe the Democratic people or the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic. I believe that there's very good Democrats out there that are
Mm.
brilliant,
Yeah,
that
like
are
Senator John Fetterman, he has been
exactly.
supporting Israel.
And
Yeah.
not only him, there's other Democrats who don't even talk about Israel who are
Mm.
wonderful.
Mm.
I don't believe that even Joe Biden, I don't believe he's an anti-Semite. He may not be smart, he may not have been a good president, but he's definitely not an anti-Semite. And but the thing that these people do is that let the radical left take over their agenda. They don't have any basis. And
Mm.
that's where we have an issue. That's why I always say that, you can vote for a Democrat. I don't think that that is wrong. But by voting for a Democrat, just
Mm.
remember you're voting for someone who is getting walked all over by the radical left. And there's no stopping that. There really isn't.
So, like, what do you think it will happen to the race, the
Yeah.
mayor race, right?
Yeah. Mamdani, look, I think he's going to win. I don't think that there's any chance that
Yeah,
he wouldn't.
I don't think so
Yeah.
either. Yeah.
And look, I really don't like Cuomo. I really don't like Eric Adams. If I'm saying that I like Cuomo over Mamdani, it really is saying something because Cuomo himself he has many, many issues. Luckily, support for Jews is not one of them. He is a staunch supporter for the Jewish people, which I respect deeply. And he has many other scandals and many other issues, but
Mm.
at least he's not an anti-Semite. So right now the polling is not looking good. I think that Mandani is going to win. And, I don't know if our city is going to turn into anything good. I look at past mayors like Mayor Bill de Blasio.
Oh,
He was
okay.
the past mayor for New York City before Eric Adams. Under him, our city turned into a garbage pail. So,
Really?
yeah, I
We should
mean,
talk about that.
he completely ruined our city. We had, Mayor Bloomberg, who was a wonderful mayor for our city,
Oh,
Mayor
yeah, yeah.
Giuliani, who was a wonderful city, completely cleaned up the
Mm.
city. And then de Blasio, what he did actually, I'm going to refer back to the charter schools. I'm having an article exactly about this coming out, hopefully today. What he
Oh,
did is he closed down all of these charter schools. He ended the
De
school voucher.
Blasio? Oh,
Yes,
really?
we also have specialized schools like Stuyvesant, Bronx Science in New York City,
Mm.
which allow, gifted kids who are very, very talented to express their talents in more sophisticated schools.
Mm.
He also was a big proponent of shutting them down too. Luckily, they're not shut down yet, but,
Oh.
the thing that scares me is that his exact plan
Mhm.
is a mirror of Mamdani's plan for education. And when we see that de
mm,
Blasio, he so obviously failed, over 120,000 students under de Blasio ended their education in public schools. They dropped out of school the most under any mayor in New York City history. When we see that many students, drop out, there's a very obvious issue here,
mm,
and what I'm scared to see under Mamdani is that he takes those views and puts them through a radical transformer. He
mm,
wants to have free grocery stores, which my parents saw in the Soviet Union.
mm.
He wants to have
What?
um, free buses. Yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's crazy. It really is. I don't see how anyone with even a small sense in politics can support someone like him, but it's the scary reality right now in the United States.
Wow. But you know what? I sense that in a sense in Japan, really. It's very sad, but I'm not, happy with all these, changes, that's happening in this country to actually see um don't exactly see the whole point of, you know, educating, well, um, there are a lot of issues in education in Japan. For example, one thing I believe actually is the education on peace. Like, we should not be using the words, like abusing it, really. Just, we cannot say that, just because we want to say it in a sense. But, I, I have a lot of friends, who have served in, I have talked with, a lot of people, who served in Iraq, after 9/11 and, Afghanistan too, you know, and some people really lost themselves. And, a lot of people kill themselves to commit suicide, in the society.
Yeah,
So, I mean, um, and I don't exactly think that, Japan, did not, join the United States in spite of the request because of the Article 9 in the Constitution. That does not mean that the United States, aggressively, attacked the nation. I
exactly.
mean, the logic is strange to me, really.
Yeah. Look, that war, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, were horrific.
Mm,
There's no, going about it. Millions of people got affected by that war.
yeah,
Millions of dollars from the United States went into
definitely.
that war,
Yeah.
and it ended up in absolutely no result. There was
Mm,
nothing that came out. Only actually the result was very poor because it gave
right.
Iran the most power in the Middle East.
Yeah.
You know, and when I look back on it, it was from our perspective an obvious mistake. There was no need for that war.
Mm,
However, if I put myself in the position of, just having the horrific events of 9/11 happen in my
yeah.
country, if I'm thinking about, and if all evidence points to, weapons of mass destruction
Mm,
in Iraq,
mm,
it
yeah.
is not illogical to start a war over it. It is not illogical. It is completely understandable. Would it be the, decision I have made as president? I don't know. But I know that there is a lot of a lack of respect for what it takes to be president. And there's mistakes that are being made. And we see even as Prime Minister Netanyahu, he has also been facing a lot of criticism internally and externally. And
Oh.
from from small either mistakes or from small situations that
Mm,
he put the country into as a preventative measure.
mm.
A wonderful book I've been reading by one of my greatest mentors, Alan Dershowitz, is
Oh, yeah,
The
he's great. Yeah.
Preventative State. Alan Dershowitz is one of my greatest mentors. I was actually just speaking to him before this podcast. He, the first book I ever read was
Please
his
give
book.
my best regard to him.
Oh, I will. Don't worry. The first book I ever read was his book.
Mm,
Um, so he wrote a new book, The Preventative State,
mm,
and it discusses this exact thing where, we can have either false positives or we could have false negatives. False positives result in preventative action that's not necessary. False
mm.
negatives result in a mass tragedy. You
Oh,
know, so which one do we want? As, the American society, which one do we want? Do we want Israel to eradicate Hamas
mm,
and for Hamas to actually turn out not to be as bad of a terrorist group as we thought? Or do we want Israel to not touch Hamas and
mm.
for Hamas to completely eradicate the entire Western world? So these types of questions are what these leaders are making. And you brought up the war in Iraq, and you know, there was no correct answer there, whether to go
Yeah,
in Iraq or
exactly.
not.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, when we put ourselves in their shoes, it's not crazy both ways, either to go or not to go. I think it's a moral decision, and that's, I think, what we have to understand.
Yeah, and in that sense, I don't think that, the United States is, aggressively, doing aggressions. Like that's like Russia. You know,
Yeah,
Soviet, well, like, yeah, Putin is doing something wrong, but or China, you know, and North Korea. Um, we, Japan cannot be just sitting and saying that, well, the United States has problems because Japan has direct problems. It's very close to North Korea and China.
yeah,
And actually, some missiles, it's very hard to intercept, really, and just a few years ago, like China fired five missiles against Japan
yeah.
for no reason. You know, I mean, um, I don't know what these journalists want to define as some kind of aggressions or pressures or oppressions.
You bring up a very good point, very, very good point here. This is what I find laughable about American society and about, the Western world as a whole. We have a leader like Donald Trump who ended how many wars? I think five wars in his term, in his first 100 days as president. He ended, the Rwanda, Congo
Uh,
situation. He ended obviously the Middle East conflict. The What else did he end? The Pakistani India, which could have turned into a nuclear
oh
war.
yeah, yeah.
You know, and when we have a leader like that, also obviously the Abraham Accords in his first term,
Oh yes,
you know,
exactly.
he he has created more peace in the world than any other president in the last, you know, 5 decades.
Yes.
So, and even the Nobel Peace Prize, which I'm writing an article about, I obviously he deserves it. Will he ever win it? No. But when we have the Western world condemning his actions,
Yeah.
in
What
peace, when we have
happened
the
in
Western
Japan?
world condemning his actions on bombing Iran's nuclear facilities,
Yeah.
when we have the New York Times saying that they weren't effective and there were, efforts that weren't
Oh
necessary,
yes, exactly,
you know,
exactly.
and they were going to escalate the conflict,
Mm,
even though they led to a ceasefire.
mm,
When we have that type of mindset in the Western world,
mm.
it's deeply disturbing. It shows that, there's true bigots in our country. It's
Yeah.
not they don't, necessarily support what's right. They support anything but Donald Trump. And
Mm,
that's my concern, you know, and I think you understand it in Japan too. It's
mm,
a similar situation with Japan, supporting the United States in a way that's more anti-Trump than it is,
mm.
actual pro-peace.
Yeah.
So I think it's an issue with not just the United States specifically, but the entire, um, alliance of the Western world, the entire Europe and everything.
Like you brought up Abraham Accords, I mean, it's a very important, I think, a step towards peace in the Middle East, right?
Definitely. Yeah,
Like, what do you think, as a Jewish, it's for,
exactly.
for Israel and, also the Arab countries, I believe.
Yeah. I'm actually going to take this a step further. I'm going to say what I think about it as an American. You
Mhm.
know, the
Yeah.
Abraham Accords were by far the biggest piece of diplomatic legislator that was ever put in place in the Middle East. And Donald Trump did it. It had great effects. The UAE and Israel traded over $2.5 billion just in the first year alone.
Mhm.
They went from enemies to friends. When we have such a radical shift and to peace in the Middle East, it shows
Mhm.
that there is peace that's possible.
Mhm.
And when Donald Trump was the leader that conducted it, it shows that you know, he's not only a staunch supporter of US interests, but he's a staunch supporter of Western interests as a whole. We have this
Yeah.
entire issue of, American exceptionalism and
Mhm.
America First agenda. But the truth is Donald Trump understands that America First includes Israel first too. And when we have a piece of, you know, something like the Abraham Accords actually take action, it brings us to question whether he can increase that peace in the Middle East, whether we
Mhm.
can have countries like Saudi Arabia, maybe
Yeah.
even Syria later on, join into the Abraham Accords, which would be revolutionary. Saudi Arabia has a, GDP of over $1 trillion. So it's completely revolutionary for the Middle East. And I think I'm a big supporter of the Abraham Accords in my articles, but I think just the Abraham Accords alone made Trump deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. It was completely, revolutionary in the Middle East.
Yeah, I really believe so too. Yes. I was quite impressed really.
Yeah.
And well, I really yeah, like actually like a few years ago, I just talk about, maybe anti-Semitism in the United States, just gonna talk it back. But an Israeli diplomat wrote a concern over anti-Semitism, just before, well, I think he left the United States, but he was, around the East Coast area, and he was talking about it, and I was wondering what he was, talking about really for a long time. And now we see this demonstration protests, and it's not democratic, right? And
Look,
also, I really
yeah,
wonder who they are in a sense, because
I'll tell you, yeah.
yeah.
You again bring up a very interesting point here. You know, first off, I am a big supporter of protests. I think it's wonderful to protest. If you protest, that means you're, participating in our country. That's why personally,
Mhm.
when I see these protests, I
Mhm.
also see an element of, people participating in government.
Mm.
And that's why even if I see protests like the No Kings protest, which I'm sure you're familiar with against Donald Trump, or the anti-immigration protests, anti-deportation protests,
Oh yeah.
um, yeah, I actually like seeing them. I think that it's beneficial. But
Mhm.
then we have completely different protests, which are
Mhm.
pro-Hamas protests,
Oh yeah.
where
Yeah.
college students are taking action upon themselves, not because they really believe in these ideas or not because they even understand them. They probably can't even point to Israel on a map, but
Yeah.
they take action because it's the cool thing to do, you know. And the thing is when we have this agenda that is considered cool or popular among
Mm.
liberals or among, you know, rising college students.
Mm.
And of course, the only reason they really think it's cool is
Mm.
because their professors who are liberals also believe in the same agenda and, teach them that what's going on in Gaza is a genocide and that Israel is a hating country and an apartheid state. When we
Mm.
have professors like that, teaching our generations, no wonder they're going to protest. Of course, why wouldn't they? You know, and the concerning thing is that y the young people are being influenced by the wrong types of leaders. I'm
Well,
actually
well, the university faculties actually are for those ideas, right?
definitely,
Yeah.
yeah, and I'm actually getting flown out later this week to
Mhm.
Florida for a conference with Pete Hegseth, Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro, a lot of these, political commentators.
Mhm.
And the reason why it's so significant is because this conference is made for educating students. You
Mhm.
know, I'm there as press and participating in the conference, but the audience of the conference is students,
Mhm.
and what they're doing is they're giving these students a way out of this, circle loophole of being taught by professors at the top universities that Israel is a Jew-hating state.
Mhm.
Believe it or not, that is really taught. Israel is a Jew-hating state. That is taught. That exact line, um, which makes no sense to me. Israel is an apartheid state. Um, and this is what this conference is about. So we need more things like that to teach the younger generation, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Do you know of a Brown University professor, Omer Bardov?
I do, of course. Of
Um,
course, I'm very familiar with that. I'm also familiar, I don't know if you have uh any knowledge about the events that went on in Colombia about a year ago with, you know,
yeah,
um
yeah, I saw all the
professors,
way. Yeah.
exactly, professors not taking any action on of encampments, and there were encampments on campuses. There was Shai Davidai, who is
Oh
a
yes. Yeah.
professor, yeah, at Columbia, who got fired for his pro-Israel rhetoric. Um, and
Crazy.
it's not only it's scary because as a student, I'm in high school currently. I
Mhm.
am currently probably the youngest advocate for Israel that there ever is. And the issue is when I look at this and when I look at me attending university, and I'm seriously considering schools like Columbia, for example. No wonder I should be scared to attend them. No wonder I should be scared to wear a kippah there.
Yeah,
But the
exactly.
concerning thing is, obviously, I have faced so much hate for my art writing that I'm immune to it. But when we see students that aren't immune to it, who actually are, going to different schools or going to schools that are not their number one choice just because they're scared of anti-Semitism. I mean, we saw that in the Holocaust. We saw that right before the Holocaust. We saw that in the 1900s when Jews immigrated into the United States for the first time. You know, and it doesn't only start at Jews, it will go conspire into other minorities. We see this hatred for Asians in these top schools because apparently they're too smart. Or we see this hatred for even Indians because they take up all the space. You know, it's a
Mhm.
huge issue, and it's a societal issue that will spread if we don't stop it now.
Well, that's very interesting, but it's not, fun to listen, to see. But when I saw Columbia University protests, it was escalating, just, there were the gate, guards, students, asking, "Are you Jews?" I mean, that's discrimination. They
Of
need
course,
to understand. And they are university students. They're a top university student. They are doing it. I
it's
am.
not, yeah, it's not only that, like you bring up, their top university students, but we have people like, um, I forgot his name, Mahmoud Khalil,
Yeah.
who is the pinnacle of, these protests, who literally organize these protests. We have people like him who are not only being praised by the entire Liberal Party right now,
Mhm.
praised like they're kings,
Yeah.
but he's a clear anti-Semite to anyone with a half a brain cell. So when we have
It's
people like that
not about,
being praised,
worrying about the,
exactly,
right?
exactly, yeah, it's they don't care. They don't care about what's going on in Gaza. They don't care to research. They don't care to read. I have this book again. I'm going to bring up Alan Dershowitz.
Mm-hmm.
This book, The Case for Israel by Alan
I
Dershowitz.
actually have it.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
the first book I ever read in my life.
Oh.
Just to share a personal story, just it's a little bit off topic, but I actually had undiagnosed ADHD, which is a learning disorder, for 16 years of my life. And then only last year I got diagnosed. And after I got diagnosed, I started listening to people like Alan Dershowitz, and it changed my entire life. I got interested in politics, and in the last year I've been able to accomplish more than I expected to accomplish in a lifetime. But um, you know, it's good that I started with this book because it taught me the values
Mm,
of, you know, why the Western world has to support Israel. And I even attended a lecture that was, um, you know, catered by the Center of Jewish History with Bill Ackman. Are you familiar with Bill Ackman? Yeah. Um, he was there. He's a wonderful guy, by the way. I met
very
him.
smart
He's
person.
very smart, very wonderful, very rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
He's
he has all the A pluses. So, in that Center of Jewish History, one of the professors that was, giving a keynote address
mm,
gave a presentation about how Jews in Israel settled, right? And
oh, yes.
the truth is that when we listen to the liberal media, we hear that Jews settled in Israel and they took all the land from the
Yes. Yeah,
Palestinians.
yeah.
That's not true. There were no Palestinians there.
Mm,
Um,
exactly.
but the interesting thing that I found about this presentation is that it was describing Israel as not a Jewish state, but more of a state that has already been violating human rights.
Yeah.
When we have the ICC, the International Criminal
Mm,
Court,
yeah.
putting warrants for arrest for the leader of Israel. You know,
It's a
it's
joke.
foolish to me, and it's very obviously bigoted. So that's the concern here. It's more of a concern not just because, we have Mahmoud Khalil in his protests, whatever, chanting Intifada, whatever he's chanting, but it's the entire, agenda behind that and the entire support behind that we see.
But like Mohammed Khalil, or some of the protesters that I see, I mean, that's, I see that, that could lead to some incitements, of
Exactly.
other violent protests, really. And, in 50s, in 1950s in Japan, there were mass protests,
Yes.
against
Hmm.
US-Japan alliance. And then, I guess that students were not studying at all. The university closed down for a few years. Well, the educational institution was not functioning as educational, institution, and some of my relatives were beaten by those protesters.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, they were, blocking people from studying. My relatives were not, shouting at them. They were just,
Hmm.
studying, and they were just wanted to. And then they, just one day, they grabbed my relative and said, like, why are you not joining? And you are subject to like beaten up, blah blah blah. I mean, this kind of group orientation acts, you know, I just remember all these violence, from 50s, 60s, and 70s. The Japanese terrorists attacked the US embassies in the Middle East, French embassies, Tel
Exactly.
Aviv, airport.
Yeah, you want to, bring up a even more recent example. You look at the anti-Trump protests in
Mm,
his under his first term.
yeah.
We had the liberal media painting Trump as this evil, fascist.
Mm,
Literally, we had the New York Times calling him a president who is a fascist.
mm.
When we have things like that, no wonder there will be people who want to take it upon themselves and save the democracy by assassinating Trump. And that's how the assassinating of Trump led to, or the failed assassination attempt of Trump led to. It's
Well,
because,
that was
you
dangerous.
know, yeah, it's not because of, Tim Cook's or whatever his name was, crazy mind. No, he was not the person who even created that assassination attempt. It was the liberal media who painted Trump as a fascist, as a disgusting president,
Mm,
as a president who should never be able to run again. It was those people who made an assassination attempt so much more likely. So that's who should be blamed. Again, once again, we see the shift, from radical to moderate, and we see that the moderate is really powering the radical.
mm,
So it brings into question what the Democratic Party is right now, whether it can even survive. And we bring up countries like Japan,
mm,
who has faced mass protests in the past that led to violence, and we bring up countries like the United States, where mass protests led to violence.
mm,
But the entire issue, I think, is that right now, so what's very different about the situation in the United States is that there is a societal backing for them, and they're not considered radical anymore. That is what's concerning.
it is, it is, well, very concerning, you know, because, well, but at the same time, I loved Israel and I admired Israel the whole time, throughout my life. And, as I told you, I have known Jewish people for a long time, right?
Hmm.
Not just one person, but, um, and And so, I mean, it's not about like the race that, who I really like, but it's about the personality and affection against people, usually, when we talk about friendship. But um October 7th happened, you
Yeah,
know. I was not like, out loud so much on Israel. But, when I, write something good about Israel on Twitter, for example, there were tons and tons of hate speeches against me. And,
exactly.
I do not need those, and at the
Yeah,
same time, I do not need to talk with these people. So I just thought that, I will not talk about Israel, but, I just still, support Israel. But after October 7th, when I saw it, and when I saw the reactions of the UN,
hmm,
you know, it's necessary to talk about it. It's
exactly.
necessary to talk about Israel the whole time. I mean,
That's why
why?
I, yeah,
You know, I mean, it's not like evil Zionists, as, just don't talk about propaganda, right?
exactly. And I've been called, evil Zionist. I've been called everything, because of my obvious, very outward support for Israel. Even in my last article, which had nothing to do with Israel, I didn't even mention it. Um, I still got thousands of comments calling me, a Zionist troll, every hate word you can imagine. And my favorite was the Down syndrome version of Ben Shapiro. That was my favorite comment. You know, I am honored by that comment if I'm compared to Ben Shapiro. But the issue there is that there's hatred. We
Mm,
don't see that on the left, on the right. We don't see this hatred on the right. We see people like Charlie Kirk, for example, going to debate the left. We don't see the right calling the left, fascists or
well,
racists. We don't see that.
actually, right people don't hate Japan either,
Yeah,
really, to be
there's
honest
no reason to.
and
There
honest, really.
Exactly. There's no reason to, and I condemn any hatred on the right when I see it.
Mm,
But the fact is that the left has turned into this festival of just hatred
mm,
for the right. And that's why our country is so divided. It's not because of Donald Trump. I
mm,
don't believe they hate Donald Trump. I
mm,
believe they hate the entire right agenda and anyone associated with the Republican Party. And when we have a party who is getting almost 50% of the vote in the United States,
mm,
it brings real concern. And, we always talk about the threat to democracy
mm,
that Trump poses.
yeah.
But how about we, begin to talk about the threat to democracy that the left poses? Because the left is the real threat we have here.
Well, see, I do not. want to actually, go into this, criticizing the presidents, but, I was not in favor of Biden so much after October 7th because, I know that he was not really anti-Semite, but, he was, at the same time, he sounded very undecisive against, all these protests that
Exactly.
was happening.
You know, it was to an extent.
Yeah,
I think Joe Biden still was a staunch supporter of Israel. I
yeah,
do believe so.
yeah.
He obviously supported Israel militarily, but
Hmm.
not anywhere close to the extent that people like Donald Trump supported Israel. No, he was questioning it. He was being influenced by the radical left. And if he, let's say, got a second term and
Mm,
he survived his entire second term,
mm,
he would have given in to the radical left even more. Even, bring up the example of Rafah.
mm.
Joe Biden was the one who told Netanyahu not to go into Rafah. And
Yeah.
then Rafah, turned
It's
out
a
to have
place where, yeah,
hostages.
there were hostages.
Yeah. So there's an obvious bias against
Mm,
Israel in the left. And the most concerning is Kamala Harris, I think, because if she won the election, she would be a direct facilitator to the radical left. She would directly give in. She was the person who endorsed AOC and all of those people. So, you know, I think that it shows we have a real issue in the United States of this left-leaning um, hatred
Well,
for
see,
Israel.
the news media, like for example, New York Times, there are a lot of subscribers, and you know, the scary part is that the media creates the image, of the
Hmm.
politicians, and Donald Trump, for example, I think that his image was really created by the media, and I have to say that I regret, I have some regrets on what I said. But, first, when he appeared, in 2016, I really thought that he was a great one. Really great candidate. And then, like, there were just so many criticisms, unbelievable, like Washington Post, you know, I was reading them and like, I did not know what to say. And Twitter was owned by a different person at that time. And
Yeah,
I don't know what's going to happen now. But it was very, Twitter banned Trump, and I mean, maybe his wording may not be perfect. His wording is not, politician, but he
exactly. I wrote an article about this in the New York Post, and this is exactly what I talk about, how I don't like Trump's rhetoric. I think that, his uh, reaction to the 2020 election was
Mhm,
not good. I think he should have accepted the results as a president should.
mhm,
However, he brings this, almost anti-cancel culture agenda
mhm,
because when you hear him talk, he doesn't censor his words. He talks how he really thinks. And
mhm,
that's what we need more in this country. I don't want, to have, politicians like Obama to represent me. I want politicians who actually do stuff and do what they say. And that's who Trump is.
mhm,
That, you can think Trump is a disgusting person. You can think his past is disgusting, whatever he's disgusting to women, I don't know.
mhm,
But what you can't say is that Trump is a full liar, because he's not. What he says, he actually does. And I tried, numerous times to write for outlets like the Washington Post, the New York
mhm.
Times. They don't accept me as a writer, obviously, because I wrote for conservative outlets. But
Really?
yeah, it's very unfortunate. I would love to contribute to the
Yeah.
uh, New York
Yeah, of
Post.
course. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, at the New York Times. Yeah. So um, when we see them framing
Mhm,
Trump as a person who is just an absolute menace to society,
mhm.
it just shows this bias in the country. And I always say that the
Because
2020 election,
mhm,
it wasn't rigged. I don't believe the 2020 election was rigged.
mhm.
I believe it was, you know, rigged, however, to the extent that the media was
Yeah,
anti-Trump.
exactly. Yeah, that's
And
true.
I think that played a big role in the election.
Mhm. So maybe I should write. to New York Times to, just let you write,
Please, please,
please, yeah, I'll
please.
do that on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I try for the New York Times, but my audience is getting bigger. The Wall Street Journal is has a bigger publication, and I write for them, so it's okay.
Oh, okay. No, I
But
mean, I'm just, curious,
yeah,
You should be discussing everywhere.
yeah, that's true.
Right? I
But
mean,
um,
fair, argument all the time.
yeah,
It's
even Alan Dershowitz, he's banned from the New York Times. The New York Times won't
what?
let him. Yeah, because he's a pro-Israel, um he's not even pro-Trump. I don't want to say that because he's not a Trump supporter, but he
Oh.
is a rational thinking person. And the New York Times is not,
Well, I guess that,
you know,
probably Alan Dershowitz is not really political, like he has his own, logic in probably legal field, professionally,
yeah, and I think that goes into politics a little bit, especially
Yeah.
with Israel.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
He's
yeah.
not really talking about domestic policy. He doesn't talk about taxes, for example, but he's very big on Israel, and
Mm,
that's important. I think that him dedicating, he inspired me fully to dedicate my life to,
mm,
politics and Israel and everything. So seeing someone like him having a voice, even if he gets so much pushback, he got pushback from his entire, left-leaning group. Seeing someone like
mm,
him, it's really an inspiration.
mm. Well, by the way, you mentioned the tax, system. Just I guess that there was a tax, law that was passed, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually wrote a piece for
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Washington
I mean, if
Times.
you could mention that, that would be
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
I wrote a piece for the Washington Times and The
Mhm.
Hill, actually. Both of them got featured on the White House website. And the interesting thing about that, the Big Beautiful Bill is what the tax bill is called.
Mm,
Um, That bill is revolutionary. We discussed charter schools. It increases the ability for charter schools to operate in the United States, which is wonderful for students.
mm,
Not only that, but it's tax cuts, which is about $10,900 for the average middle class family, is huge.
mm,
Um, Also, obviously, you hear all over the media that there's so many cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. The truth is, there's not $1 of cuts to Medicare, and for Medicaid, all they have is a new work requirement that requires able-bodied adults to work if you have no dependents or have no medical conditions, which
mm,
is common sense. And the requirement is to work less than 80 hours a month when
mm.
a average American works more than 170 hours a month, you
Yeah.
know. So that's obvious to me. Not only that, but the left-leaning media has painted it as a tax cut only for the rich. Um, that's not really true. The reason why, the rich get a disproportionate amount of tax cuts is because the rich pay the most taxes. You know, a $10,000 tax cut for someone making $1 million a year is much less than a $10,000 tax cut for someone making $100,000 a year. And when we have the top 1% paying 50% of the taxes, no wonder they get a tax cut. Like, it's common sense. But um, it's a wonderful bill. To criticize it a little bit, I've spoken with Representative Mike Lawler. I don't know if you're familiar with
Okay,
him.
yeah, yeah, yeah. From
Yeah.
New York, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he's a representative, one of my close mentors too. I've spoken with him about it, and he's a big supporter of salt tax. What salt tax is, state deduction tax. Basically, you pay state taxes
Oh.
before you pay federal taxes, which decreases the amount you pay in federal taxes. The Tax Cuts from Jobs Act in 2017 capped this at $10,000. This one, because of, push from people like Mike Lawler,
Mhm.
increased it to 40,000. I disagree with that. I think it adds to the deficit. Um, and that's the main issue with this bill is that it adds to the deficit. But other than that, the bill is wonderful. It really is. It's a revolutionary, piece of legislative, um,
Mm.
you know, that was passed under the Trump administration.
Well, see, maybe, listen to that. The Japanese media is getting, obviously they're getting information from New York Times, to be honest. Yeah, probably about
Mhm.
Israel as well.
Yeah,
And, like some major newspaper companies share the same buildings
exactly.
in Japan. So, I mean, but, at the same time, I just do not understand. the state-sponsored media, NHK, which, requires subscriptions for every person who owns a TV. It's
Wow. You bring up such a good point. I'm not, are you familiar with NPR and PBS, the outlets?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Obviously Trump cut funding for them.
Mm-hmm.
And those are quite literally state-sponsored media.
Mm-hmm.
NPR, PBS.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a democratic society, if we want a democratic society, how are we having state-sponsored media? That's the complete opposite. You know, why are we funding outlets for their agenda? That's not what we should be doing. You know, Mandani, I looked into his legislative history and I uncovered a very interesting piece of legislator,
Mm-hmm.
um, which he actually uh, co-sponsored a bill that would allocate over 50% of all funding that New York State puts into media
Mm-hmm.
to ethnic outlets that have a minority basis of less than 10% in New York City. So, you know, when we have millions of dollars going into that,
Mm-hmm.
and we have mayoral candidate who is, directly co-sponsoring that type of things,
Mm-hmm.
that's not a democratic society. There's a clear issue there. We shouldn't be sponsoring media. It's the bare minimum a democratic society can do. So I don't know. I think it's very important to take that out and to ensure that we don't have that basis in our society at all.
Yeah, but in Japan, Al Jazeera, just goes through all the time every day in on NHK, which is a state-sponsored media. They read out, the information from Al Jazeera. I mean, every day for decades, they have
Hmm.
been doing this. And of course, the public opinion leans to that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because, they require people to pay for them, and they're watching the propaganda every day,
Yeah.
right?
And when we look at Al Jazeera, who is also a state-sponsored media,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
state-sponsored by
It's a
Qatar.
pyramid. Yeah.
You know, it is clearly biased to anyone with half a brain cell. Again, you know, so I read Al Jazeera
Mm,
personally because
mm.
I enjoy reading other opinions
Yeah,
and I
exactly.
enjoy
Yeah.
reading,
Mm,
radical things too.
mhm,
So that's why I read Al Jazeera. But
mm,
when we have state-sponsored media
mm,
relying on off Al Jazeera as a reliable source
mm.
or relying off CNN as a reliable source,
Yeah.
there's a clear issue. And look, I agree. I think Fox News, for example, I think it's biased. Of course, it's biased. I
Mm,
think that the Daily Caller or any other
mm,
right-leaning media is obviously biased.
mm,
And but I support, reading maybe Al Jazeera and also reading the Jerusalem Post.
mm,
Just show both sides. Don't just completely show one side. That's not
yeah,
what media is
exactly.
supposed to do.
Yeah. Exactly. See, one-sided story, does not represent the truth.
Exactly.
We have to see from various perspectives, really. And it's very hard to say what's fact or what's true, what's wrong, really, in many ways, especially, in a war, I really do not want to talk about it, but, it's very hard to see. I don't think that, what Al Jazeera is saying is true because they get information from Hamas, right?
Hmm.
I mean, Hamas has been, Googling for information. And
Yeah.
it's like, I have been, reading, honest reporting, it's very interesting to me. But it's obviously I
Yeah.
don't really have words on that. And I hope that there will be some kind of improvement because, you know, we we cannot just listen to a story and believe that it's true. I
Yeah.
mean,
And also, I believe the situation in Gaza is not good. I don't think it's good. I don't think anyone thinks it's good. Well, no wonder because they're in a war, That's
yeah.
what
Yeah,
happens when
exactly.
you're in a war. It's not
Yeah.
supposed to be good,
Hmm.
but it's not a genocide. Maybe they're missing
No.
out on dessert. it's not a, famine or anything.
Hmm.
So reporting like this is completely biased. It uses Hamas's own numbers, which
Hmm.
doesn't distinguish between combatants or civilians.
Yeah,
It is ridiculous. I mean, I can't imagine. Look, I think that it's very important to check the IDF to put the Israeli government in its place. I
exactly.
think it's
Yes,
important
yes,
to
that's right.
have other sources
Hmm.
to, fact check everything. But when you are using Hamas's numbers, a registered terrorist organization by 100 plus countries around the world, come on, like there's a clear issue here. If you can't see it, then you're just biased. Like, I mean, it's ridiculous. It really is.
Yeah, I actually invited former reserve colonel, from IDF, and he was talking about this famine, or this genocide, all these things. But well, the war is a hard situation, of course, but at the same time, there is no benefit in intentionally, targeting the civilians
Yeah,
because who differentiate Hamas who is dressed in the civilian clothes, right?
exactly.
And
That's
I
true.
mean, you know, and actually the media cannot confirm any stories. We saw the famous, probably you've seen it too, right? I mean, the IDF soldier shooting. And the Japanese media just shows it. Oh, they're shooting.
Yeah.
It's, well,
It's not, look,
no.
I don't think the IDF was perfect. It's not perfect. IDF makes mistakes. There's not everyone in the IDF, I'm sure, is wonderful
No,
people.
and also, it did not, the media could not even say where it happened,
Exactly.
actually.
And but it's very clear the IDF as a military as a whole is a much better military than any other military in the world because
Yeah,
look at the
exactly.
civilian to casualty
Yeah,
ratio.
yeah.
In Gaza, it's about 1 to 1, one civilian for one combatant.
Hmm.
In places like Afghanistan, it's 4 to 1, 4 civilians for one
Yeah,
combatant.
yeah.
So it's ridiculous. Like, how can you criticize Israel as a whole? How can you do that?
Mm,
It's impossible. I mean, their military is taking more precaution than any other military in the world. Their military is also facing a much more dangerous situation than any other military in the
oh,
world
yes,
by,
exactly. Yeah.
being in urban areas.
Hmm.
Their military is taking precautionary measures where they,
Yes.
if they want to strike, they have to first look into a building, and even if there's one civilian and 100 terrorists, they wouldn't strike that building. So, it's a very obvious issue. Like,
But what surprised me was this Nazi ideology that
yeah.
has been glorified
Mhm.
Gaza. And we cannot deny the fact that 60,000 people poured into Israel on October 7th. I mean, not just, the Hamas. And I'm not for the collective punishment, but at the same time, I mean, we have to say, like, we cannot just say that, this civilian home is destroyed, you know, because there are tunnels like at the
Yeah.
entrance, right?
And you bring up a good point. Like, a lot of people have been asking, what do we do after? How
Mhm.
do we resolve this conflict?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we need to. Netanyahu right now is in the United States. He's actually talking with Donald Trump
Mhm.
about how to resolve it, obviously. And it's a very confusing question. I don't believe there's a correct answer. Personally, my perspective is this, that in order to resolve the conflict, obviously the United States will get involved. We saw Trump's plan to evacuate Gazans into other countries and
Mhm.
basically clean up Gaza. I actually don't believe he wants to do that. What I believe he wants to do is he wants the United States to make a deal with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or any other, Egypt even,
Mhm.
basically for the United States to threaten to get involved in the Gaza conflict, to take over Gaza,
Mhm.
or for countries like Egypt to take responsibility of the Gazans. The
Mhm.
reason why Egypt would take responsibility of the Gazans is because, what they really don't want is US involvement. They don't want US involvement in the Middle East.
Mhm.
So this would force them to take hold. And when we have countries like Egypt, who is a relatively, you know, based country, it has morals, it respects the United States, it has diplomacy with Israel too. If they take over Gaza, then there's no that's going to happen. Gaza will be a clean place. But the only way to do that is to have US involvement. And
Yeah, I think
when,
that that's what I agree to, and also that's what why Trump is important to
yeah,
the
yeah,
world.
yeah, exactly. But the UN is going to condemn this move. The UN is going to
And we don't
create,
care about the UN.
yeah. To be honest, I have written several articles about this. I believe that the UN is useless at this
Yeah,
moment. I think
exactly.
that it should be shut down for good.
Yeah.
Um, and I think
Oh,
it certainly won a purpose,
yeah.
but right now it's just an anti-Israel body. When we have
Yeah.
even in Congress, when Netanyahu last year came to Congress and gave a speech, a joint Congress address,
Mhm.
and when we had 300 Democratic candidate or Democratic Congress members leave and boycott that speech, well,
What?
no
Oh
wonder
yeah, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
clear, yeah, there's a clear hatred
Mhm.
in the Democratic Party for Israel. It's obvious.
Well, I don't actually see probably Netanyahu, that, probably, I don't exactly don't want to get into the domestic politics, but, in terms of this conflict, I think that he is doing very well, you know.
I agree.
So,
I
and
look, I don't
I don't want to blame him really. That,
exactly. I don't think I personally
mm,
I don't believe I can have a perspective in Israeli politics because I'm not an Israeli citizen. Leave that up to Israeli citizens. But I believe from what I see on the outside that Netanyahu, there's good things about him, there's bad things about him. There's things I like, and don't like. Like I don't like, for example, the entire thing with the judicial review in Israel, but him, reforming that. But I also believe that he's a very strong leader. He's
yeah,
probably the
exactly.
strongest leader Israel has had. Well, Ezra actually has had numerous strong leaders, but him specifically, like what he has done in the war, you can't say that it was bad. He is a wonderful leader, and I
Mm,
respect him deeply. I think he's wonderful.
yes.
Um, so he is a testament to why Israel in particular is a democratic country, because obviously not everyone in Israel supports him,
Mhm.
but he's also a symbol to me, of uh true strength. I think him
Yeah,
supporting
I,
Israel
I, I really
unequivocally.
have. Yeah, I agree with you. Yes. Yes. It's probably, about the time and you have something to do in the morning. Yes. But I, I really, during just this election, the presidential election when Trump won, I really, really felt that Trump needed to win,
Exactly. He
for
did.
many reasons.
Yeah. And even if you weren't a Trump supporter, even if you
Yes.
hated Trump, he still needed to win. Um, you know, and I even in my articles I wrote this, like if you're a Jewish person, you can't vote for Kamala Harris in that case. You
Mm,
can't because she's anti-Israel, she's an anti-Semite in disguise.
mm,
She allows people like AOC to have a platform. And that's my issue with her. Even Bernie Sanders, people like him, to have a platform. So, you know, it's ridiculous. It really is. I'm so thankful for Trump that he won. I'm so thankful that he has, you know, a lot of strength to show that he is an unequivocal supporter of Israel. It's wonderful to see. It really is.
yeah, yes. And, lastly, well, ideally, I will not say anything realistically here, but, Hamas needs to free all the hostages
I agree.
without condition.
I agree. Of course,
In with,
Hamas needs to free all the hostages.
yeah, I was truly angry when I saw the stage of this Hamas that created, this Kufir's mom.
Hmm.
And, I just felt that, they are utilizing, some of the propaganda, well, like the protest that's happening, in Israel, and, they believe that, they can utilize it in a sense, but, it's different. But, but I just felt that, I was so angry, really,
Yeah,
truly angry. I mean, they need to honor people, and they are not even honoring the Gazans. And look at what's happening. They are beating
exactly.
up people. That's terrible.
Yeah, just, to add one more thing, it's, in my opinion, it's extremely important to release the hostages. I am doing everything in my ability to advocate to release the hostages. Um, but I think the Israeli government has a duty to also make sure that it doesn't overly focus on just releasing the hostages. There's more to
Oh,
that with the
yeah. Yeah,
so
sadly,
if we have, just one goal, just to release the hostages, the war is not going to be successful. Our
exactly.
goal should be to eliminate Hamas,
Yeah.
and that should come first because Hamas
We'll
poses the
come
biggest threat
back
to Israel.
for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there will be maybe this time there's
More,
however
right?
many,
Yeah.
however, 300 hostages that unfortunately Hamas captured, but
Mhm.
next time there will be, let's say, 3,000.
Yes,
And what are we
exactly.
going to do then? So I think that there's issues that need to be taken into perspective. I think
Mhm.
releasing the hostages has to be a priority.
Yeah.
And I think that the hostages symbolize a moral,
Yes,
a
exactly. That's
moral
what I'm
dilemma
trying to say.
for, yeah, that's why people are so in support for releasing the hostages. And personally,
However, yeah, when I saw October 7th, I really felt there's another one, really. There may
yeah,
be. So Hamas really needs to be, you know,
yeah. And the hostages need to be released. Those are the two priorities, I believe, of the war. I
mhm.
think both of them are equally as important. If the hostages don't get released, it will be just as devastating as Hamas not being eradicated. I really think so, because of just the moral, you know, agenda the hostages, pose to the entire
Exactly.
state of
Yeah.
Israel.
So, but I believe, I have my fingers crossed, I pray for Israel to win, of course, and I believe that there will be a peace because of the United States and, the Israel strong leader right now. So,
Yeah,
I
I
just,
believe there will be peace
yeah,
too. Yeah, I always peace.
right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So, I hope that, yeah, just send me, more articles when you
of
write.
course.
You know,
Of course, it was so wonderful to, be on. I would love to, come on your show again
of
if you're
course.
interested.
Yes,
You
please
know,
do.
yeah.
We
Just
should
let me
do
know when
this.
you need a guest.
Yes, yes,
Just
please.
yeah, let me know
I would love
anytime.
to welcome you.
Yeah, anytime. Let me know. If there's any other ability to get involved in what you're doing, it would be wonderful.
Yes,
Um,
that would be great. Yeah, I would be
you,
honored, really.
just out of curiosity, I was wondering, like, I know you have a podcast, you have a Substack. Do you
Mhm.
write also for publications, or do you write
I
as a
have actually, written two books, and I can send you one of them. But it's an ebook, but I'm just thinking of making it into a printed one because
oh,
it's about my friend, a
mhm.
lifelong friend. But I call him a friend, but he's much older, and he passed away. But he was a world-renowned craftsman. He has met, various leaders, political leaders. His artwork became official tribute to the royal families. All these things. He has done for Japan is a lot because he introduced the play culture of Japan, and
Mhm.
also not just that. Uh, he, it was just after the World War II, and you know, it was not necessarily a good relationship between Japan and the United States, but he tried his best, all the time to, show friendliness to people and through his tops. He was not very talkative, but he expressed, his feelings with tops, like wooden toys.
Hmm.
It's related to Jewish culture, and that's why, I don't know donated, and I'm donating my
Oh wow.
all of his wooden work to Tekatin Museum, to be
Yeah.
honest,
Hmm.
right?
That's
I
wonderful.
mean, I have a reason for it, and one reason is that, it needs conservation. And
Hmm.
also, there are like Israeli craftsmen, who make wooden toys, tops, and they could, see, Mr. Hiri's artworks, wooden toys. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and also one of the things is that, um, yeah, I just, he had a friend in Israel, to be honest. And I was supposed to visit him, his friend in Israel, and then the war started.
Oh wow.
But like unfortunately, but I'm probably visiting Israel next year. I cannot, visit Israel because of my mom, but yeah, I'm really really excited, about what happened. And what impressed me the most was
Exactly.
the curator,
Hmm.
and the people whom I spoke with. They were so understanding to what what I had in mind for decades, because these toys are not just toys, but these toys are memories of people,
Yeah.
really made upon the memories of the people for reasons. And I will, you probably understand why I say this. I'll just, send you the book, really.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm actually writing my first book. Um, it's about education, about school choice and everything. So,
Really?
um, yeah, hopefully
Okay.
I'll finish it
Yeah.
by the summer.
Yeah. Let me know when you finish it.
Of course. Thank you
And
so, so much.
but anyway, yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I just hope that you come back again.
Thank you. Please invite me on whenever.
Yes, sure, of course.
Yeah, thank
So,
you so much. Thank
okay,
you.
so I hope you have a nice day. Thank
Thank you.
you. I don't know how many of the actual Japanese people are listening, but there are listeners from Japan. I hope that you will understand how much the Japanese media are trying to paint the US politics at this moment. And um, I have to say that um, the talk of the customs, we did not mention, well, I did not mention this part to Gregory, and I asked him to explain the U.S. politics for the audience, so that it's easy for people to understand. Well, his columns are very interesting, and also very, uh, I have to say, discusses a lot. Um, I don't know why New York Times, Washington Post don't want to invite him. Maybe they should, right? I mean, you know what? I'm not asking for myself, for on behalf of myself, but the New York Times, Washington Post seems to ban Dr. Alan Dershowitz too. You know what? That's not liberalism in the first place, to restrict the speech made by people because of certain creed or religion. And these people say, right, the Jews are different from Israelis. Zionists are different from Israelis. Okay, Netanyahu Zionists. They are racist. They have racist rhetoric of Zionism coming from Russia. Well, this tends to be persistent in, I guess, online search, and also search engines, not just um, not just what I say. I'm not saying that. people should hate, whatever. But the fact, okay, I just saw a comment today, posting, well, you should look at the UN report. You know what? Before, you know what? These people, one sided people, do not look at every side of the opinions. You know what? I check Al Jazeera, okay? As Gregory says, you know what? It's important to know what is being discussed. And I totally disagree with Al Jazeera. And I would like to invite a person who used to work for Al Jazeera to be honest. So, anyway, the Japanese media can keep on reading out. I'm not going to stop them from doing that. And that's probably the order of what? New York Times, right? Fine. Go ahead, do that. Destroy themselves. They're destroying whatever. Just they think that they can create everything, control everything, right? Fine. Then believe it. But anyway, we had a very, very meaningful discussion, and we're not trying to destroy something. Myself or he's not trying to destroy, and on the other hand, he's a very, very constructive person, and also very nice person, and so I hope that I think that he's a very promising person too. And if anyone in the United States, the political commentators interested in him, please contact him. Anyway, I hope that I will post his articles, some of his articles, um, um, on the description. So please take a look. So I hope you have a good day. Well, in New York, in the East Coast, the day is starting. In Israel, the day, it's in the evening. Well, not in the evening exactly, it's 5. And the day is ending in Japan. So I hope you have a good night. Anyway, good night.